If you'll indulge me, I want to play a little game of word association. Okay, so what comes to mind when you see this word? I'll give you a moment to ruminate on that. Okay, what about an association with this one? To see this word association game out to its logical conclusion, we could attempt to disentangle the denotations and connotations of these two words slash terms by simply defining both of them. So, what is empathy? On its most rudimentary level, empathy can be thought of as the ability to understand and share another's emotional state or context. The reality is much more complex, with empathy being applied to more than half a dozen distinct phenomena that are not simply components of a single thing, but rather conceptually distinct psychological states. But the idea of stepping into another's shoes is one of the most generalizable and intuitive understandings of the term empathy. Now, how would you go about defining a video game? Especially in the context of empathy, it's very likely you're thinking of this type of game. For people who don't really have exposure to video game circuits of discourse, the most heavily saturated breed of game in our culture is the first person shooter. If this was the type of game you thought of, it pretty intuitively follows that the objectively reprehensible acts of massacring hundreds of in game characters would lead to a level of disengagement from such acts and erasure of empathy. The conversation of video games having a causal relationship with real life violence tends to be in tandem with conservative moral panic, but there's definitely a fair amount of academic scholarships to support an inverse relationship between these types of games and empathy. Van Shai and Wigman established in a 1997 paper that frequency of video game play was negatively related to measures of pro social behavior and positively related to measures of antisocial behavior. And in a 2010 paper, Anderson et al. Found in a summary of experimental studies that exposure to violent video games causally increases aggressive thoughts, affect, and behavior and decreases prosocial tendencies. But for me, when I think of video games as a vehicle and contributor to emotion, I think of in my own experience, but also on a broader cultural scale, The Last of Us seismically shifted the way in which video games were conceptualized. Instead of solely focusing on the violence and spectacle of its gameplay mechanics, The Last of Us was defined by the story it told and the emotional connections players formed with the characters. This connection was intensified to an unprecedented extent through character realism and player to character interactivity. By including the behavioral mannerisms of real people with motion capture technology of actors' performances in its gameplay, The Last of Us offered players communicative clues, expressions, and movements to immerse them in simulated social interactivity. Within this context, video games could be a promising new approach for developing empathy, since they provide situated, action oriented, and embodied experiences that quite literally allow people to step into someone else's shoes. Computer games are also low cost and widespread among the population, and if effective, could have a wide impact on promoting a more empathic society. In fact, a 2020 study by Wolsonari et al. Found that narrative pro social games like The Last of Us positively impacted perspective taking of players and increased their levels of empathy. When considering how intuitively it follows that the unique form of video games themselves promote empathy, it's kind of befuddling to understand why they've been such a punching bag of sociological critique and had their cultural significance constantly undermined since their inception. I think a huge reason for this is the dismissal of video games as a form of art. And for any naysayers that still can't fathom the idea of a video game as an art or legitimate vehicle for empathy, I would implore them to consider What Remains of Edith Finch was released in 2017, 4 years after The Last of Us. You adopt the perspective of a 17-year-old Edith Finch as she returns to explore her family home. By inhabiting the personhood of an in universe character and thereby manifesting new moral perspectives, players use personal context to frame the moral choices and mindsets of the characters. By breaking down the motives and rationales of their character, the player creates a narrative space to merge their life experiences. Players' relatedness to the characters also stimulates self reflection, results in changes in moral perspective, and pro social beliefs. When players relate to and empathize with the playable characters, they create a space for the reconfigurations of their own moral perspectives. In a game that handles themes of trauma, mental illness, and substance abuse, the empathy elicited in this particular game has societal importance. In Anderson's 2022 study of empathy and moral agency in video games, one participant explained, "These characters are real people, having horrible experiences but also great experiences together. Ironically, the player is a human being with human experiences who is playing a game where people have human experiences. We're playing a game that reflects human experience. I think that draws me in and makes you reflect on humanity and about the humanity of others around you."